Okay.
There we are.
Good evening. We're very delighted to have Barbara Anderson here from the Interior Design Program, and she's going to talk on sustainability and interior design. And she's here at K-State, and we're happy to have you here, and thank you for coming and speaking this evening.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and stand up here so I'll be out of the way of the slides that I prepared. And I want to give you a little bit of my background first. I have a Bachelor's of Architecture from K-State. I have a Master of Architecture from KU. My professional practice experience over about 20 years or more has been in historic preservation. As an educator, I find the greatest opportunities to be helping students who may think that they're in college to get a better job when they're out, to think of their time in education more broadly, and to think about how they might use their education to be better citizens and to actually have a big impact on the world, not just the impact of making a living in something they enjoy, which is, of course, a good idea too. But I think it's really important to keep in mind what the bigger issues really are. Okay, so I want to start by talking about what interior designers are concerned with, and I like this image from Stewart Brand's How Buildings Learn, because it is a very simple way to think about what people in the built environment built environment professions are working with every day, and what parts of that built environment they're most concerned with. Now, Frank Duffy originated the idea of shearing layers. He only had 4 layers. And he was a Brit, so he had these great names for them. But he talked about the shell, and he thought it lasted about 50 years in the UK. And he talked about services, things like, he called them cabling, but plumbing, air conditioning, the lifts, they were replaced every 15 years or so. Scenery is what he called the layout of partitions, the dropped ceilings, any kinds of set design is how he would have thought about it. And he thought those lasted about 5 to 7 years in commercial interiors. And then he talked about the set, furniture and accessories that changed frequently, even monthly. Stewart Brand created this image, and he changed that definition of layering, and I really like his definition. He added 2 layers, and he talked about the site and how it's an eternal component of the built environment. The structure has a life that ranges from 30 to 300 years. The skin changes every 20 years or so, depending on fashion and technology. Services last 7 to 15 years. Space plan changes in commercial spaces is often every 3 years, and in residential spaces it can last 30 or more years. And then he always says that stuff changes all the time. And the reason I want to start with this is because I think Russell Ackoff, who's a systems theorist, and he is brilliant, really, he says that problems are claimed and named by the person who recognizes it. So when you think about the problem of creating a sustainable built environment, you have to be thinking, who's naming the problem? Who's claiming the problem? And interior designers generally approach sustainability as an issue of stuff, the most quickly changing aspect of the built environment. Now, that doesn't mean that's all interior designers are concerned with, but it's the thing that you always think about an interior designer doing. They select stuff, they decide where stuff should be placed, and so in a way we come by naturally a fixation on stuff as the way we're going to make a sustainable interior. But I want to talk about other things, and I want to refocus the thinking about that. So primarily interior designers now think of green or environmental design or ecologically responsible design or sustainable design as having to do with the material choices for furnishings and finishes, In a little bit, I'll show you an example of what I mean by that. But they also think of efficiency in energy and water use. They have, forever, practically, it seems, been working with things like enhancing quality of life through things like universal design in the last 20 years. Daylighting has always been an issue in interiors. They look at indoor air quality and reducing toxic chemicals in building materials and in maintenance practices. And I'm not saying any of these things are bad. I think all of those things are good. But what I'm going to talk about tonight are broadening the thinking about what interior designers should be concerned with as they try to achieve better design, more ecologically responsible design. I'm a preservationist, as I said earlier, and my entire career as a preservationist, I've thought of my focus on the technical, the economic, and philosophical issues related to preserving buildings and neighborhoods, downtowns, and cultural landscapes, which are an all-encompassing kind of thing. You can think of our campus as a cultural landscape, a representation of our culture's impact on the land. For me, it's always partly been about conserving natural resources. I was educated to be an architect in the 70s and early 80s, late 70s, early 80s. And so my education was shaped in many ways by the response to the oil crisis of the middle 70s. One thing that's really clear to me, because my focus in historic preservation has been on technology. I'm a material technology person. So I'm all about material assemblies, material characteristics, proper treatments for material preservation. And my knowledge of materials and assemblies and how they work and why historic assemblies and materials were like they were, and then my knowledge of the technological approach, the low-tech approaches to things like human comfort through ventilation, those things have colored my perspective on what a sustainable future might be like. And so I believe that adapting existing buildings as part of a wise and sustainable approach to management of the built environment is a huge priority for built environment professionals. I believe that we have to have high-tech new buildings to achieve sustainability. I believe all new construction needs to use the high-tech approaches that we now know work, and we need to keep advancing our discoveries in technology so that we can make better buildings when we build new. We also need to advance our technologies so that we can make better adaptations of existing buildings. So when in fact, I've submitted to EDRA, hopefully I'll be presenting at EDRA in May, about the idea that we have a myopic view in general of new high-tech buildings being the solution to a sustainable future in the built environment. And I think we have to find balance between reusing existing buildings and adapting them to be sustainable, and also building all new buildings to meet much higher standards. Now, another thing I'd like to talk about is to think about the way our natural rates of change affect different aspects of our work with the built environment. And this is a fantastic little image, I think, from Stuart Brand again, but this is his book, The Clock of the Long Now, Time and Responsibility. I think it's one of the best books that's small that you can imagine. I mean, you can read this book in a day easily, and just leisurely. It's fantastic, but it's got a lot of great information. And I've actually seen many, many other people who clearly were influenced by that book in significant ways, and they've written some great things based on it. But when Stuart Brand talks about time and the rate of change in nature, he is looking at the work of scientists like R.V. O'Neill and C.S. Halling, and he's looking at how they're trying to understand how ecological systems manage change and how they absorb and incorporate change. And so this image is one that represents the speed of change as it relates to different aspects of the world. And so nature evolves very slowly. Culture changes a little more rapidly, and this is deep culture, not superficial things. Governance changes even more slowly. Our infrastructure changes a little bit more quickly. Commerce changes pretty rapidly to respond to changing economic situations. And then fashion changes almost erratically because we've all seen fashions come and go, and almost now you can get anything you want at any time. And the reason I show you this is because interior design is often thought to be basically fashion and commerce, right? Yep. Yeah. And architects would think they're really part of infrastructure, right? And civil engineers are definitely making infrastructure. And do you see what I mean? So I like to talk about this a little bit just so you start to think about rate of change and where change is happening quickly. All right, now I want to shift gears a little bit because I want to talk about a human ecological focus in interior design. And this is really my own scholarship with my colleagues Majette Kaup and Peggy Honey, all in our program in interior design. We've been shaping our interior design curriculum around a human ecological focus. And what we are trying to do is to make sure that our interior design students, first and foremost, have a human ecological framework for how they think about their future as interior designers. Rather than being driven by fashion and commerce, we want them to be driven by more fundamental issues. So we think the primary relationships between a human ecologist's point of view and an interior designer's point of view, or an interior designer who is a human ecologist's point of view, would be that we should practice sustainable, or better yet, rejuvenating design, construction, and management of the built environment. That we have to focus always on improving quality of life through design that applies knowledge of environment and behavior. And the thing that's really interesting is our students take environment and behavior courses from the first semester they're with us, and it's always an underlying theme in their studio work and other things. And that's fairly unusual for any design program, much less interiors program. And we also want our students to be imagining and envisioning that their work will fulfill human needs through the support of individuals, families, and communities in their access to suitable goods, services, employment, education, recreation, and housing. So we see our students as having a lot to do with social interdependence and quality of life and sort of raising people up and giving them more. All right, so this slide is about dealing with the negative side, but showing you that there's a positive side to the material consumption influence that interior design both has and reflects. My work in material values and environmental attitudes, it has been very rewarding to me, and I'm going to start a big project soon that will launch a much more intense study of material values and environmental attitudes among design students. But on the negative side, interior design is a driver of material consumption. And in part, it's driven by a desire for material consumption. So I think about the fact that so many designers will say, well, I'm making better selections of finishes and furnishings, but they're not necessarily the best selections. They're still making some selections that are not so good. So they're doing the less bad, as William McDonough would say. And then we have interior designers who are driven to material excess as either artistic self-expression or as expression on behalf of their clients. There's a lot of work done on how our material life is used for self-expression, and particularly as it relates to our sense of self and success. And a lot of times interior designers get caught up in their client's desire to show off their success or affluence. And then the third negative that I think is a significant one is that, and this is my preservationist coming through again, interior designers are willing to demolish existing and serviceable interiors for the sake of client desires and fashion. And I think this is a really horrible thing that we need to get over. And David Orr talks about how we can't cause any ugliness at any time or any place with the choices we make. And I think of the times when people gut a perfectly good building just to change the look. I think of that as one of the ugliest practices of any design professional. So that is my very strong opinion because I'm a preservationist, probably. On the positive side, interior design can actually be an antidote to materialism. There's a lot of studies now that show that materialism is, and this is a woman named Dittmer, says it's a cage within. A cage around us and within us that keeps us from being psychologically healthy and happy. We have standards expressed to us by the media that we can't possibly meet in terms of affluence, in terms of the body perfect and the good life, and that yearning for what is impossible is a big problem to us psychologically. But interior designers can actually help clients see the benefits of using less space, and I think this is a huge one that is still mostly off the radar for all built environment professionals, okay? So it's not just interior designers who have to think about how much space is enough. But I think we have an obligation to show our clients that less space is actually still functional and actually might be as good as any other choice they have. I really believe that interior designers can show their clients that retaining existing serviceable interior features and finishes is of great value to them and to their and in their ecological responsibility. And then I always talk to my students about style as opposed to fashion. Fashion implies a temporal quality, that it will go out of fashion, right? However, style can mean that it is good design that abides by fundamental principles of design that have been fairly constant over time. And what's interesting about that is that the scientists who are studying our perceptions and our preferences are showing all kinds of great things. And I didn't bring all the citations with me tonight, but I want to talk about a few of them. One of them is that we prefer facial symmetry. In human faces, we prefer symmetry. And it's an absolute fact. They've proved it over and over. Another is that humans prefer the shape of the acacia tree over other tree shapes. They theorize that because we all started out on the savanna in Africa, and that was the tree that was common, that that's sort of a basic preference that we come by naturally. Another one is really fun. They have looked at the colors that we prefer. And they specifically looked at the colors of green we prefer. And the colors of green we prefer across cultures over time, the colors of greens we prefer are the really healthy greens of healthy plants. We don't like sickly greens. We don't like gray greens, the kind of sick, dying plant green. I think it's interesting. I think we're going to find that there are truly fundamental aesthetic preferences. And if we can design to those fundamental aesthetic preferences, then we can design buildings and interiors and objects that have lasting qualities. And we won't need to be driven by fashion and temporal change as much. We'll see. The thing that's very interesting to me is that I adopted interior design about 10 years ago. I would have called myself a preservation consultant before then. And I worked mostly with architects as their technical consultant on preservation issues. But when I adopted interior design, because I saw so much potential for interior designers, I started realizing what those potentials really were. And those potentials are here in my final bullet. I think interior designers are the most focused of all built environment designers on human users. And because of that, we have the greatest potential to impact human quality of life. And I believe it's our objective to make livable, adaptable, nurturing, long-lasting, and loved interiors. I believe that. That's what I hope for every day when I teach my students. And I think it's interesting because interior designers have been pushing on manufacturers to make better materials, to make better products. And so they've been sort of outward pushing. Ray Anderson of Interface Carpet tells a story about their mid-course correction in the 1990s, and he says that one thing he noticed that was that clients, mostly interior designers, were asking for better carpet. Carpet that wasn't as bad for the environment, carpet that could be recycled. And so interior designers have for a long time been pushing for products that are better. And they've been caring about indoor air quality and daylighting and just human users in general. And I think we have a long way to go. That's why I'm so critical of our amount of space we use and the fact that we'll gut anything and start over for fashion. I mean, very critical about those. But I also see that we have a huge amount of potential and inertia toward creating a better future. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about public misconceptions because I know this is probably what you're familiar with. So in the popular press and in even our professional press, we will often praise eco-friendly buildings and residences, and we'll talk about them being just fantastic because they're eco-friendly or they're sustainable or whatever it is, they're healthy. And yet they'll be really large spaces. And I want to talk about that just for a little bit, and I'm going to refer to a couple of basic things. Here's a house that's ecological and fabulous. This was in the USA Today that I picked up when I was in Chicago a year ago. And it was a great story. And it just struck me as, you know, it wasn't a great story in that it was a great story. It was a great story for me. Because the writer, Marco R. Della Cava, said, this is a quote, he called it, a quote, a haven with an ecological ethos. Isn't that great? Okay. Guess how many square feet it was for a family of 4? Just throw some numbers out.
3,000.
Higher.
12,000?
112. That's good. It was 4,200. But let me put something in perspective for you. 50 years ago, our houses were less than half as big as they are now, on average. All new houses being built 50 years ago were basically half as big. And we had more people per family living in them. Okay? So there's this great article that you all probably want to see, but it's by Alex Wilson and Jessica Boland. It's 2005. The title is Small is Beautiful, U.S. House Size, Resource Use, and the Environment. It was published in the Journal of Industrial Ecology, Volume 9, Issues 1 and 2. And here's a quote from their abstract. In new single-family houses constructed in the United States, living area per family member has increased by a factor of 3 since the 1950s. In comparing the energy performance of compact, they put in parentheses small, and large single-family houses, we find that a small house built to only moderate energy performance standards uses substantially less energy for heating and cooling than a large house built to very high energy performance standards. So if you think about how much energy we use in buildings and how much water we use in buildings, and you start thinking about how much space we heat and cool, no matter how high tech we get, no matter how efficient we get, we're really better off still to build small. So small and high tech, think what we could achieve, right? That would be fantastic. So for me, at least, it's hugely important that everybody, the public, the design professionals, everybody get the idea that small is going to be more important in the future. Now, small means that we have to make it adaptable, flexible, right? Because small gets crowded. So there's got to be more ingenuity in how we design to make small spaces that really work for us, that are still comfortable and pleasant and do what we need them to do. Okay, now I want to talk about some professional misconceptions. There are lots of them. Our journals and our professional press in interior design, just as the architecture press I see, has a lot of what I would call sort of suspicious literature. You know, there's good stuff in there, and there's some that's misleading. And so I think we all need to really take a critical look at what the press includes and describes as ecologically responsible or sustainable or green. And I'm going to use this example because I really think it's important to start being very critical of the media, of what's getting out there about sustainability. So here's the deal. We have these textbooks now coming online like crazy that are about sustainability in interiors, sustainability in architecture. I have shelves full of them. And when you get really down to it and you look very carefully, you'll see all kinds of fallacies in their thinking. And I want to show you an example. But I got to tell you the story. So this book comes out, and everybody's been so excited. We're going to have this one book dedicated to interior design and sustainability. It's about 3 years ago, or something like that. Let me see. It was only a year ago. I got the book. I opened it up. I'm looking through it, and I'm like, oh, wow. You know, well, at least they covered that. And, oh, look at that. I was like, huh. So finally I got to this illustration. Here it is. This is the illustration, and this is the blown-up caption and key. Okay, so I get to the illustration, and I go, oh, my goodness. I think I said a bad word. But I went out in the hall to see if my colleagues were there, because we all leave our doors open, and I said, you won't believe this. So here's what I saw, and it just about got me. This is an image in the book, Sustainable Design for Interior Environments, and it's an apartment, you can see, or a house. And there's the front door if you need a little guidance. And there's a sort of living area, and then a hallway and a kitchen with eat-in and a dining, and then there's more living back there, and there's a little den or something, probably has a little pull-out bed, and then a bedroom, a big bathroom with lots of stuff and no doors to it. Do you get that? You can't really, you can close off every place with a toilet, but otherwise there's no doors. And then, okay, so we've got all these closets and hallways and bathrooms and all right. Here's my analysis. Simple as it can be. 2,700 square feet, approximately. based on a 3-foot door, and then, of course it didn't have a scale. And this is how the space portions out. So we have living, this pale peach color, dining is the blue, sleeping is the lavender, food preparation is the golden, and the grooming is the pink. And I left all of the circulation and storage out. They didn't even count them, but look how much there is. If we calculated that, it would be a huge percentage, right? So what's interesting about this is there's one bedroom. It doesn't even have a door. Do you see how? That's where whoever lives here sleeps. And there's no door, like you can, right? There's no door. So at most, probably 2 people live here. And yet this was what was in the sort of hallmark everybody was waiting for it book on sustainability in interiors. And the reason this can happen is because we just aren't making those connections yet. This book had to be edited, reviewed. I mean, lots of people saw this before it came out, but I was the one who said, whoa, back. Why are we needing 2,700? My family lives in less square footage than that, and we have 4 of us and a dog. I grew up in way less than that, and there were 6 of us. Right? Okay. We'll just have to find a way to get to reduction. Okay, so I'm just gonna end and let you ask me questions, I think, because I've probably provoked some ideas. We'll see. But I love this quote. I think it fits how I think about our obligations, and probably fits why I believe and have always worked in preservation. And to me, preservation and sustainability are very much partners. And if you go to Europe, you'll find that is the attitude. There's a seamless relationship between them. In the U.S., we don't have that. And I believe it's because in the U.S., we don't educate people who are going to work in the built environment professions the way they do in Europe. We don't think of the built environment professions as managers of the existing built environment. We think of them as people who add to the built environment with new work. Do you see what I'm saying? And I think that we need to make a little switch here, because if you go to Europe, you see them thinking of themselves as holistic managers of the built environment. And so that includes preserving, it includes making new, it includes serious decisions about tearing things down and reconstructing it. There's a whole lot more of a coordinated systems thinking about built environment management. And I think that's where we've got to go to. And I think we're slowly recognizing that. There's a group who's been convened, actually it's a multiple organization group that's convened with the U.S. Green Building Council to try to work through making LEED better, a more compatible measure when you're working with historic buildings and the reuse of existing buildings. And people in the preservation community are thinking about how they might be more receptive to new technologies in historic buildings. I worked with a student at the University of Maryland getting a master's in historic preservation 2 years ago. She finished last year. And her thesis was fantastic because she talked about how the sustainability movement, she researched and wrote about how the sustainability movement is all about objective measures and efficiencies. And the preservation movement is about cultural meaning and not efficiency exactly, but they have a long-term perspective that isn't as embodied in sustainability as it could be. And so her work was very interesting. And one of the things I kept talking to her about was the fact that preservationists over time have always allowed new technologies into existing buildings. So we have an old building that never had heating or air conditioning. You know, just had fireplaces and they opened the windows. They didn't have bug screens, and we allow things to be added to historic buildings all the time. Very few historic buildings no longer have heating or air conditioning. Almost all of them do. There's a lot of reasons why. It's not just human comfort, because we can preserve the building better if we can have heating and air conditioning in a building, because we can keep the temperature stable, we can keep the relative humidity stable. There's all kinds of reasons why. But what happens in preservation is that we take such a long view, we change really slowly. So our long view fights against the fact that we, right now, as preservationists, have to change really quickly, because we've got to accept new technologies quickly, or historic buildings will become so inefficient that they won't be preserved. So it's this really interesting stage we're in. I think we need to see a shift in all the way that building environment professionals are educated and think of themselves more like the Europeans do. And I think preservationists have to think differently about new technologies in historic buildings. And I think the new high-tech green building people could learn an awful lot from preservationists who have always considered some things that green building technology folks could adapt to. For example, I was talking to an architecture faculty member, because we have a graduate student we're working with, and I told him one of the things I was going to talk about at EDRA next year if I get accepted, and it is this. In engineering and architecture, we always know that our assemblies have to have chemical compatibility and physical compatibility. So when we put metal and attach it to something, we have to have a chemically compatible fastener, and we have to have a physically compatible fastener. So the metal's going to expand and contract differently than the substrate. We have to have a joint that works. Okay, so we know that, right? But what preservationists have always known, and building professionals today don't know anymore, even though building professionals 100 years ago knew it, is that we need assemblies that have similar life expectancies for all materials in the assembly, or you have to be able to disassemble it and replace those things with short lives and put it back together so that you can continue to maintain it. That's what preservationists have been doing the whole time. But building trades and professionals in the building industry sort of quit thinking about lifespan compatibility at the time we started making assemblies as monolithic. We started making windows that you didn't repair. We started making masonry walls that you didn't repoint. Right? And when we started doing that and considering our work on initial construction permanent, then we lost that third component of compatibilities that are necessary in assemblies. So there's just a whole bunch of those things. I have 11 things I want to talk about at EDRA, but you only got one or two. So anyway, I will entertain questions now, I think.
Well, I have one. I think it might be good for you to discuss the optimum size of an interior space. How, as an interior designer, you try to arrive at that. You kind of criticize this floor plan for being large, but how do you decide what's optimum?
Well, one thing that you can do, and this is really tricky, because what you have to do is convince a client that they don't need. Did you see the house had 3 living spaces? We can go back. Go to, I think this was it. Okay, so we have 3 living spaces. We have this one, which is obviously the main living space, but that appears to be the front door. And then we have this little living space that obviously functions as a guest bedroom, I think. Don't you think the couch pulls out? And then we have the back sort of family room or something. One of the things we have to do is start to talk about the research being done on family relationships. Because some of the research is real clear. We're now spending our time apart, even in our houses. Our families are not spending time together. And there have been some studies that show some correlation between dysfunction in families and the fact that we spend very little time together. So you could bring out that research and you could say, you know, I know you'd like to have all these spaces to watch TV or hang out or whatever, but let's talk about ways you can have a stronger family, better behaved children, you know, all these things we won't all want, right? And so for one of the things we've been talking about as a human ecological framework for interior design is to use human behavior studies to help clients understand better choices. And I think that will make a big difference. But part of it is just making people aware that 2,700 square feet is an unholy amount of space for 2 people. I mean, I actually did a little sketch and some of us came up with 4 apartments. You can get at least 4 one-bedroom apartments in that amount of space. Really? Comfortable ones. So there could be 8 people living where 2 people live.
So you're saying you need to work with your client to decide how big it is, but you may need to sketch something out and show them something that you feel is about right and get them to buy it as part of what you maybe need to do.
Yeah, and I think you have to have that evidence. The research shows that your family will, you know, be stronger, your children will grow up better, because there are all kinds of studies about children with electronics. Just a TV in the bedroom makes you more likely to be obese. Studies that show that access to the internet on a computer in your bedroom as a teen makes you more likely to be a smoker and engage in sexual relationships before, you know, everybody wants you to. But there's all these studies that show that there's these negative consequences. And so what we would do is point to these things and say, you know, you really don't want your children's bedroom to be the place they hang out. This is what kids do now, though. They have enough electronics and entertainment, and they go there and they just hang out. That's their living room. This is not good for families.
There's no exercise room there.
No, there isn't. They could convert a room, couldn't they? They could convert their den to that.
They can just run around it.
That's true. They have this circulation system, right? Right. I mean, I don't want to just pick on this. There's so many examples. I mean, we could talk about the $100,000 Japanese gold-plated bathtub. And, I mean, you know, just craziness in terms of material waste that goes on in interiors as an expression of affluence, as fashion. It's unbelievable. I mean, I grew up without a lot of money, and I was just astounded to find out how much some things cost, right?
I think it's easy to understand your concept, and I agree with them, but I think just the vast majority of the people are just, if they have money, they're not going to care, you know? If I have a lot of money to throw around, I'm going to get a big house. That's all there is to it.
Okay, let me tell you what some of my research is looking at. And I mean, I know you all know the studies that show how many Earths it would take if everybody on Earth lived like Americans do, which is just this crazy. I mean, we can't possibly have that level of material, I don't want to call it wealth because I think it's a terrible word, material abuse around the globe. But what can we do to model the good life in a way that is reasonable and material goods. You know, I think that's the real key, and in fact, that's the study. I'm actually got a draft paper that I'm working on right now that is about how do we know when the good life is good. How do we know it's a good life if we have less material stuff? And there's been lots of studies, lots of cognitive psychologists, all the people who do happiness work, Csikszentmihalyi and Seligman, all those people, the psychology of happiness, positive psychology they call it. They're really honing in on this. It's very clear that our attitudes toward materials are not healthy, and they are not making us happy. They're making us unhappy in many ways, and that we just need to find a better model. Now, the Dittmer book I talked about earlier, Body Perfect and Good Life, it's sort of the subtitle. She says that the world over, the epitome of the good life and the body perfect is expressed in the Hollywood and sort of mass media that comes out of the U.S. And Dittmer's a European, and most of her authors are European, but some of them are U.S. authors. So really it's a matter of the U.S. reshaping for the world what the good life is.
Well, our foundations are like the 1950s, the American dream. And I mean, everybody's still trying to live that. Everybody wants their own car. We all want a big house.
With a yard.
It's like sustaining, and like you're talking about preserving, and like how we used to have these smaller houses. They just didn't have the means of making them bigger, otherwise they would have.
But we won't have the means. Yeah. See, we're quickly coming to the point where we're going to have to face the reality that we don't have the means to live the way we've been living. It's very apparent
that it's going to happen, but it's kind of like how we've always learned through history.
I know.
It's when it's a problem physically, or it's a problem for our surroundings when it's actually going to be done.
Right. Well, one of the things that we talk about among faculty and in the work we're doing together is that we hope it won't take a crisis of significant proportion to make us adjust.
Wouldn't that be nice?
David Orr talks about the need for a governor, like a throttle, the governor on an old diesel engine or something. And it's excellent. And he talks about how Mennonites have a natural governor in that they have to go by horse. And so they can't go very far in a day, and their crops they work their fields with animal labor. And so they have a natural governor to their material acquisition. And I think it's an interesting way to think. Now, that brings up a whole lot of issues about sort of like what kind of future will we face, and different people have different ideas about that.
So it seems to me, as you think about what you're doing, that it's good to think in terms of the triple bottom line, looking at the economics and the environmental impacts and the social value, and that
right.
the whole process of trying to bring that into interior design, and not simply think in terms of how big a house can I afford,
right?
Which is one of the logics that some people have.
Right. They have the logic of how much can I afford, and then they have the logic of, well, I'll just make it all a little greener. I'll choose bamboo and, I don't know, some cradle textile for my chair, and I'll call it good because I did my part. That's the part I don't like. I just really don't like that sort of blinder way of thinking about material things. I'd like to sort of mention one thing that I think is really critical, and we'll see if this happens or not. But I'm teaching a course for the first time. It may be the last time. We'll see how it goes. The students are enjoying it. We don't have the money to teach it every time, but I'm teaching a course on sustainability in interiors, and the focus is on it's a history, culture, technology framework, but we're focusing on how we might envision a future that is sustainable, truly, or rejuvenating, an ecologically responsible, harmonious future, and what interior design will be like in that future. And so we've been reading all these futurist articles about what the future could be like, and we've been paying attention to the issues of how culture might change, how technology will change or probably will change. And it's been fun because the students have realized that part of getting to where we want to be is being able to really envision it. You know, being able to say, this is where we want to go. Let's try to go there, rather than, I wonder where we're going to end up. And so it's been really fun to do. I think it would be, I don't know how it's going to go at the end, but it is really fun to imagine futures that we want to see happen. And there are two futures that we are sort of leaning toward. The one that both of these have been envisioned by a guy called Constanza. I can't remember his first name right now, but one's a sort of Star Trek future where we've got all this great energy and we're galactic, right? And so we're just out in space and we're like Star Trek. And the other future,
I like Star Trek.
yeah, there's all these issues. I mean, when you really get down to it, there'll be lots of issues in that future. And the other feature is I think he calls it an ectopia, where we're still earthbound and we are more, our population doesn't grow as much as the Star Trek population, and we're more agrarian, small communities, more like Manhattan size, and that these small communities make these networks that are interdependent and self-sufficient. And actually the students really gravitate to both of those, but they like the ectopia better. And I think that's because that's where we are. We're in the Midwest, and I think that's sort of more familiar.
Maybe that Star Trek wasn't popular too.
It could be that they aren't as familiar with Star Trek, but I have a feeling that if we were in New York City or London, or I think the Star Trek might be more likely to come up high on the list of I'd rather have that future. So, but anyway, I think really starting to think, what is the future you want to see happen? How can I make us move that direction? I think that's going to be a huge, huge factor. And I don't hear us talking about that very much. I hear us talking about new technologies, more efficiency, those kinds of things. Oh, also, this is one more thing. I was educated when we did solar buildings. I did passive solar buildings when I was an architecture student. We had closed loop water systems. They grossed me out. I still gross out by them. I know we'll probably have to go to that because water is going to be a big issue. But I really don't want to see the sustainability movement cause us to think that there is a certain appearance of sustainable buildings. I want sustainable buildings to be able to look like many different things so that we don't attach a style or a fashion to it. I really can't stand that idea because I really think that's what caused the demise of solar design in the late 70s, early 80s, was because people went, if I have to have a solar building and it has to look like that, forget it. I don't want that, you know. And it was just a death knell. We can't have anyone thinking that sustainable design looks a certain way. It would be a very bad thing. All right, so any more questions?
Any more questions? Thank you very much.
Thank you. You're welcome.